recording, and pause and take a deep breath and say, hello, Jeanie and Joan. I'm so glad to have you.
Good
Hi,
morning.
Becky.
So just a quick note for those of you who do not know Jeanie and Joan. Before the broadcast, they were sitting in opposite seats. So it says Jeanie and Joan, but as you look at them, you are actually looking at Joan on the left and Jeanie on the right. And if you do know Jeanie and Joan, we're going to have a chance in a minute for you to share that with us. But we are so glad that you are here today. And what we want to do is start out with a poll so that we can get to know you a little bit. And I will share the results of the poll. So today, as we talk about Jeanie and Joan's book, we are going to be covering a few very heartfelt topics: despair, hope, and forgiveness. And we wanted to get a sense so that we can tailor our thoughts to you, which of these is most meaningful to you today, or what you're most curious about today. So I'm going to give you a few minutes, and then I will share with all of you the results that we're seeing come in as it relates to what you are most curious about: despair, hope, or forgiveness. And thank you to many of you who are participating. So Joan and Jeanie, while we're waiting for folks to answer the poll, maybe you can tell where in the world you've called in from today. It looks like we do have some Canadians on the call besides you. So share, please.
We're in Victoria, BC, on the west coast of Canada.
And as we've been watching the chat pop up with people from all around the world, it's really nice to see that we have both Canadians and Americans from both sides of the coast, from the Atlantic coast, eastern coast, and western coast, and actually people from around the world as well. So that's it's really nice to be in community with folks this morning.
I totally agree. And let's take a look. It looks like of our topics, hope is the one that most are curious about today, with 43% of folks wanting to hear more about hope, 38% wanting to hear about forgiveness, and only about 19 thinking about despair today. So we have a second poll that we want to do today. And let me see. I just have to figure out how. So forgive me for just a moment. What we'd like to talk about next is your familiarity with the topic of appreciative inquiry, or AI. So a lot of Jeanie and Joan's work is based on appreciative inquiry, and we're going to be talking about that today. So if you could take a quick moment and answer this question: are you already familiar with appreciative inquiry? And so we would love to hear about your past exposure to this topic, because it will also inform how we shape our comments today. So thanks to you who are already answering the poll. You have some quick poll answering fingers, and we appreciate having the chance to get to know you and find out about your background. So thanks to those of you who are answering. I'm going to close that one up quickly and share those results. It looks like we have about a 50-50 audience, with slightly more of our attendees today being familiar with appreciative inquiry. And we have one more quick poll for you as we get started. We're curious, have you met Joan and Jeanie before? If you are not familiar with their work at all, let us know that, if you're somewhat familiar or if you are very familiar. And it's always interesting to see what previous exposure our attendees have to the content that we're promoting. And I'll just give a few more seconds on that. And thanks to many of you who are answering. And it looks like we have quite a few folks on this call who have never met the two of you before. So as we dive into today's conversations, let me share just a little bit. I have been getting to know Joan and Jeanie over the past few months as we've been working to relaunch their amazing book, Building Resilience with Appreciative Inquiry. And they are the co-presidents of their company, and their company is called Cockell, McArthur-Blair Consulting. Sorry about that. And they work with organizations around the world and bring many different types of consulting and training to those organizations. And as you read the book, you'll hear some stories of the organizations that they've served and the amazing results that they are able to create. So welcome, Joan and Jeanie. I'm so glad that we can have this conversation today.
We're happy to be here and see some familiar names coming up on the chat. That's really exciting.
And so, you know, it's wonderful to meet new colleagues out in the world who are interested in working with resilience, and it's wonderful to see old friends' names pop up on the on the chat. And it's really great that we have so many people who are not familiar with our work, and so we really encourage you as we go along to ask questions and make sure that we're providing insights that are useful to you around resilience.
Wonderful. So let's go ahead and dive in. And I'm excited for us to share this amazing model that you've created that explains how these concepts of hope, despair, and forgiveness come together. So why don't you talk to us a little bit about the basis of this idea of appreciative resilience and how it has come about?
Let's start.
Yeah, I can start. Well, as we've said, and you've said, Becky, is that we've worked with Appreciative Inquiry for many, many years. And as we did that, we realized there were some other things going on beyond the particular projects that we were brought in for. And that was the journey to resilience, as people saw each other more clearly as they worked through an appreciative process. And so we thought about that notion of people being able to work better together, to be resilient, and we thought, let's put the two together and see what happens as we focus on the notion of the impact of the Appreciative Inquiry processes, principles, being AI leaders as a process of resilience. And I'll let Joan talk about the inner circles that surrounds.
Well, and I think that the evolution of this working in resilience kind of came about after many, many years, as Jeanie says, of working with leaders and leaders saying to us, we're having experiences, and leadership isn't a flat line. Like, we're not having this experience of being excellent every day, and we're experiencing times of despair and very challenging times, and what do we do in those times? And so this has been a long evolution. When we first started working on resilience, we started working on this idea of despair and using appreciative inquiry in challenging times. And we really began to realize that the practice of hope and a hopeful view, and we're going to talk about that more in a few minutes, was a powerful practice in resilience. And so we began to think about hope and despair as kind of two things that people move back and forth from. And as we talked to leaders about resilience, we began also to realize there was something else profoundly going on, and that was the practice of forgiveness. And so we began to study and talk to leaders about these three ideas of hope, despair, and forgiveness, and how an amplification of both a deep understanding of them and a practice within them can uplift leaders in challenging times. And one of the things we always say when we talk about our work in resilience is, Jeanie and I do a commentary on resilience. We really want to create an invitation for leaders to create their own resilience practice. And we're really interested in understanding how other people see resilience, because it is a huge field. And so Jeanie and I take a piece of that large resilience practice and apply it to leaders in all walks of life.
Oops, sorry about that. Well, so maybe we can go for those about half on the call who are not familiar with appreciative inquiry and go back a little bit to the basis for the appreciative resilience work and explain and define appreciative inquiry for our attendees.
Well, we do have a definition on the next slide, I think. Aubrey, thank you. So this is a very basic definition of appreciative inquiry, which is it's a way of bringing positive and generative change to human systems, whether that's organizations, communities, large systems, or whether it's the individual system, families, small groups, individual people. So it's those kinds of changes, and I think more importantly than anything is the second part of this, which is the natural way of being and seeing the world every day through an appreciative lens, through the lens of curiosity and appreciation. And we define the term appreciative inquiry further based on those two words. So to appreciate really is to value something, to increase in value and to be very fully aware of whatever is going on. So many people say, well, appreciative inquiry ignores the problems. Well, to be fully aware, you have to look at everything. And in that looking at everything, you don't ignore the problems, you actually solve the problems by inquiring into what you value, what are the strengths, what's working, in order to get more of what you're paying attention to, what you're inquiring into. And that allows the problems to be solved.
So when we started the resilience work, we realized that it needed, not just because Jeanie and I work in the field of appreciative inquiry, but it needed to be housed in this conversation of appreciating what is and inquiring into what might be. Because fundamentally, that's what resilience is. What exists at this moment, what is possible in the next step and the step after that.
It's very deeply profound, and I think that what I'd like to kind of circle back to, Jeanie, is just this idea that it's not about ignoring the problems, because I think that there is this tendency to think, well, you know, those of us who have had some exposure to appreciative inquiry, you know, it's only about looking for what's good. So I don't know if you could just restate that again for those of us who might be having trouble catching on. About how the problems are actually solved by looking at what's positive.
Well, you know, we spend a lot of times, you know, if you can imagine, you know, have you ever sat in a meeting where, you know, the agenda is a list of problems, and you sit there and you carefully solve all those problems. And then somehow when you come back together, the problems are still needing to be solved. So it's a kind of spiral that doesn't really get you anywhere, and it gets you depressed, if anything. Mm-hmm. So if you come together as a team, say, and you actually focus on, let's just tell a quick story about what success we've had in since we last met last month or whenever it was. The energy shifts, and then the problems come up, and you go, well, actually, we're doing this over here, and we could share this idea together that's working, and that would help each of us in all our different ways, because you're sharing things that are successes and things that are working. So suddenly people get energized and listen to one another about what's happening, and focusing on even the team itself. That brings energy to the team, and teams are much more functional when they're listening and positive with one another. They're more generative, they generate solutions, and we don't ignore that. Sometimes we work with organizations where we actually have to go in and say, tell us all your problems, just begin there. But don't spend a lot of time there, just get them, and it doesn't take a lot of time. People are easily able to just say, these are our issues. And then once those are identified, then say, okay, well, behind those issues, what would it look like? What are you yearning for? What would it look like if those were not your issues? What is it you really want? And do a reframing exercise around those. And then that is what you inquire into, because it gives, again, people hope that there are things that they want, and that they can look for those, even smallest bits of those, in order to grow that, rather than growing a problem. Because what you focus on actually grows. That's part of appreciative inquiry. What you focus on will grow. So if you stay in the problem, in problem solving mode, without shifting to, well, where are we already working well, then you will get stuck in that problem, as opposed to building and moving into the future in a really generative way, in ways you hadn't even imagined.
And I've just noticed a couple chats coming up. One person said, you know, it sounds like the fundamentals of good coaching, focusing on what we long for. And another person popped up in the chat that this idea of reframing into what is possible and what might happen. And so absolutely, people are popping up in the chat some of the fundamental pieces of appreciative inquiry. And appreciative inquiry is a huge field of study. And we want to give, of course, a shout out to David Cooperrider, whose work in the early 80s sent many of us researchers and practitioners on this journey of appreciative inquiry.
And to add to that, David Cooperrider wrote the foreword to our book, a beautiful, beautiful job he did. And he's identified what was really interesting. He, in that foreword, has identified sort of the 3 stages of appreciative inquiry. First, the first way appreciative inquiry was used was to look at the exceptional moments. Like, just look at those absolutely astounding excellences And then it kind of moved on to, well, why don't we just look at the ordinary moments and look at the best of the ordinary moments? So that was the second kind of stage. And then this last stage, which we're included within that, and there's others doing this, of course, is to look at using appreciative inquiry to look at the challenging moments. So it's a wonderful capturing of kind of a history, and because it's an evolutionary process. David and others were the originators and copyrighted to the public domain. So all of us can own appreciative inquiry. We all contribute. Many, many, many people all around the world have contributed to appreciative inquiry, to what it is now. It's really amazing. It's a global movement.
Well, and the chat is just blowing up, and we're going to enjoy reading some of that later, because it is really hard to stay present in the moment and be thinking about the conversation and acknowledge what's happening. But I do see a question that came in that says, can you speak to when people might create statements about what's working or strengths that there is not evidence for or no evidence for? Is that helpful? And in some ways, I think that kind of speaks to something you bring out in the book in the section about hope, of like finding the tiniest glimmer of hope and building on that. So what thoughts do you have about people creating those statements about what's working or strengths when there might not be evidence of something working or there being strengths?
Well, I think fundamentally, appreciative inquiry is action-based research, finding evidence to move forward. And so I'm not sure what context the question is asked in, but let's take a team, for example, and they're not doing well. They're not getting along well, or they're not working well together. And you could say, well, there's no evidence of working well together. And so you begin to ask the question of, tell a story of a time you were on a team that worked well. The evidence doesn't have to exist inside the organization for appreciative inquiry to begin to pick up strengths that emphasize what is possible and begin to move it forward. So you find those strengths where you can find them. And Becky just said this, you know, sometimes those strengths are the tiniest piece of light. In you know, appreciative inquiry for strategic planning, you're going to find strengths inside an organization unless the organization's in real trouble. But sometimes appreciative inquiry in complex conversations around systemic despair and around issues of power, privilege, and difference, they're really complicated, and it's harder to find those places of strengths to begin. And so you need to take that time.
And in those situations of, you know, people who are advocating for difference, right? For actually shifting the power and privilege dynamics. You don't ignore those issues, but you look at how is it we're doing this well? How is it we're moving this forward in our world to make our world a better place for all? So, you know, that's a big complex to, you know, the team, to, you know, me waking up in a hospital almost dead and realizing that I could focus on the fact that I couldn't talk, I was intubated, I couldn't move, I was broken everywhere. I'd been in a coma for 2 or 3 days. Joan was beside the bed, and I'm going, what happened? What happened? Why am I not able to talk? What is it I'm able to do? And that's what I focused on. What could I do? Well, I could listen, I could smile, I could focus on the fact that I was alive. So, that's a little way you can practice being AI. It's just, what is it that is what I want to focus on?
Yeah, that is so powerful. Well, so let's shift, and we want to talk about these 3 core concepts of hope and forgiveness and despair. And we're going to start with hope, and hope is the one that folks on this call indicated that they are most curious about. So let's camp out here for a while and talk about hope.
Well, in our work on resilience, we really, we've had many conversations with leaders, and for people who haven't had a chance to read the book, there are leadership stories in the book by other leaders from around the world. And we asked them about, all of them practiced appreciative inquiry. So we wanted to set that outer circle of practice. And we talked to them about hope, despair, and forgiveness in so many ways. And hope is that fundamental practice of resilience. It is the thing that uplifts us and moves us forward. And when we talk about hope, we don't mean the kind of hope that predicts it's going to turn out okay. we mean the kind of hope, the hope and an abiding, hopeful view that deeply understands that within this situation, it is possible to do something, to actually hold to the tiniest of hope and a hopeful view. And we see this in incredible literature. Viktor Frankl talks about hope and a hopeful view in this way. And so, so this is kind of a deep dive into hope, to hold within ourselves as leaders the idea that not only can I uplift for myself the possibility of hope and a hopeful view, but also for others. And it builds the capacity for resilience. I work with many people who practice hope and a hopeful view, and their focus in incredibly complex leadership times was always on, within this crisis, what are we doing well within this crisis? Sometimes you can't stop the crisis from happening at work, but within that crisis, what are we focusing on that we're doing well? And so hope is that fundamental practice. And we really talk about this in the book a lot, about the fact that hope is a practice. That we practice it every day, that we undertake to think about hope every day, and we consciously do so. And so we say to leaders, you know, and this is your homework for all the people on here, you know, what is it you did as a leader today that both communicated hope and uplifted hope in other people? And it's the, you know, kind of going back to the model that we flashed on the beginning there. These three things, hope, despair, and forgiveness, you know, contract and elongate as circles in our daily lives as leaders. And we talked to one CEO and talked about the fact we were writing on resilience, and particularly on hope, despair, and forgiveness. And she said, that describes my daily life, the sine curve of my daily life. And so hope is that fundamental practice of resilience. What do you want to add?
Well, I want to emphasize the notion of practice. Yeah, we really emphasize this in our book about resilience is a practice, hope is a practice, because that's the part, as Joan says, that's key really to being resilient, is to continue to live a hopeful view. And, you know, sometimes people say, well, tell us how to get there. And it's not an arrival. It's a journey, a continual journey of going through the various states. Every day you have maybe a little moment of despair, maybe big. It's just you're living through it for a while, right, until it goes. And forgiveness is, you know, as we'll talk about, is kind of a willful choice you can make every day of just kind of letting things go so you can get back to hope, right? Because hope feels so much better, and you open up and are able to do things and think better and be better and just enjoy life more fully. But that's a practice, because it doesn't even, the two of us who work so hard on this, like we have to think, okay, what should we start with today? Let's do a gratitude practice. And you know, that's one of the practices you can use, concrete practice that really helps to start the day off in a hopeful view.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about that, because that's exactly the question that was coming to my mind when you talk about hope as a practice. I always want to get really practical. So as a leader, either starting the day or in the middle of the day when something's going wrong or something's blowing up, you know, what would incorporating a hopeful practice look like?
Well, I think that, you know, I think to begin with something simple, right? And so you think about meeting with your team at work. You might say to your team, you know, what's one thing we have to celebrate this week, right? It uplifts hope, right? Saying to team members that you know are dealing with really complex things, you know, what is it that you think as a team we're doing that's supporting the complexity of what you're trying to do? So to begin, the power, appreciative inquiry, questions, the curiosity, the power of a powerful question, and also the deep self-reflection. What am I doing as a leader that is powerful in the moment to help people move forward? And, you know, I think one of the things that you have to pay attention to with hope is not about ignoring what is wrong. Hope is deeply recognizing how complex situations are, how difficult situations are. And within that, finding a possibility of being powerfully human in that moment.
So we have a question here from Jim, and he said that hope, as he's understood it to mean, is an expectation of a preferred future. Does that match with how you're describing hope here?
Hope is can be an expectation of a preferred future, but it also, again, I'll use Jeanie just told a story earlier about her accident, right? In that example, Jeanie held on to hope that she might be able to move a muscle or be able to sit up in bed. We actually didn't know if she was going to live or die, right? So the expectation is that she'll be alive. But hope is also pulling right back to the moment. The hope that today she's going to move a leg. And so it's also the pulling in to the powerful moment. And of course, you know, when you read incredible people like Viktor Frankl, this is his, I think, view of hope. Around him, tragedy was happening on a massive scale. And yet he held to the idea that within this, we can be human. Within this, we can do small things. And so I think it is not always an expectation of an ideal outcome. It's an expectation of, in this moment, a recognition of the fact that there's something worthy of noticing here.
Well, I love that. So hope in each moment of being able to appreciate or identify something positive about that moment, and thinking about what can come about for a better future.
And so somebody just popped up. I just noticed a chat go by. I'm sure there's tons of questions coming up that I can't see because I'm paying attention. But I noticed somebody just popped up. What do I say to people who say that hope is denying reality? I think that hope deeply recognizes reality. It is a deep recognition of what is, and within that, a recognition of what small thing might be possible. What small thing can you do as a leader to uplift and move forward?
And as a leader, the practice of hope oneself and encouraging the practice of hope in others. As a leader, the actual practice of seeing those people that you're interacting with from a view of their strengths and what they've done well, it just shifts that way that they start to look at themselves, because they're hearing from you that you see them for those strengths or contributions to the team, however. And that is a practice of hope for everyone, to then also get into that notion of seeing each other from that position of what's working here, what are we doing well, and let's celebrate our successes with each other and as a team.
Well, and I know as a leader, what I would love is for that to become the natural way of looking at problems.
Yeah.
You know, I would love it if, you know, my hallmark as a leader is, well, Becky always told us to see what was good in the situation, or, you know, what we could celebrate in the situation, or even what we could learn from the situation. Because I think, you know, that can be hopeful if we could say, okay, everything's falling apart right now, but we're learning something, and there's hope in just the fact of learning something when you're in a bad moment.
Yeah, I think so. I think, and that notion of learning is generative. It's going forward, and so yeah, encouraging people to do that and also see it, you know, pausing and seeing it.
So a couple of comments coming in. Anne says maybe hope is an antidote to despair, and as we shift to talking about despair later on in the call, hopefully we can address that. And John says it seems like part of hope may be seeing the worst of circumstances and realizing that it is not all of my reality. I can ask, what else can I notice or learn or do?
Yeah, and that's a powerful comment. Yeah. What else can I notice, learn, or do? And one of the things that you know, you were asking Becky a place to start. One of the questions I ask myself often when I face a problem is, what is the yearning in this problem? Because every problem is a powerful yearning for something. And when we focus on the yearning, we begin to attach to this idea of hope. What are we yearning for within this problem? And it helps us move from the problem to the possibility of something else.
Because what happens and what the outcome is often not what you think that you're putting forward is in your hope, is this outcome. And in fact, the outcome that does happen is actually absolutely meant to be. So hope is about believing that what's meant to be will be. Moving along, that's part of resilience.
So here are a couple of other questions that came in at the same time, so I'll speak them both. Sierra is wondering how you would say hope relates to optimism, and Gary says, how is faith connected to hope?
I think hope and optimism are often used interchangeably, right? And this is one of the huge complexities in writing the book. And maybe you want to answer this hope and optimism question.
Well, I believe that optimism also is a particular way of viewing the world, is the expectation that as I was saying, what's meant to be will be, but also that it is a possibility of a positive future. So I think they're very similar.
And optimism is often that kind of holding on to it's going to turn out this way, but I think they're so interconnected that we wouldn't kind of separate them in definition.
And I think optimism is also looking for the good things in the world and just being open to that, to really paying attention to that, which is also a practice because our minds often go to the fear mode and all the rest of it. So optimism to me is also about holding that open mind to saying, well, I think I'm going to look for what possibilities there are here.
And Becky, just say second question again.
How is faith connected to hope?
And see, Jeanie and I really struggled with this when we decided to write on resilience. Is that we realized that we're both educators, we're long-term educators, and we're coming at resilience from the white privilege. We're Canadians, which brings certain privileges in the world, and so. We realize we come to this work from a particular place. And that's why we really talked about it as a commentary. So we're not theologians, but we would encourage people to take our work and relate it to theological understandings that they have about resilience. Because I think faith-based work across the world religions has an incredible amount to say about resilience. But we're really clear that that's not our background in terms of being able to answer the relationship between hope and faith-based understanding of hope.
I just want to say an emphasis on what Joan is saying is that, these are our lifetime and work and so on and experiences and our research and study and listening to other leaders. And it's all about kind of putting it together. As Joan said earlier, it's a commentary. So we continually weave in reflective questions for people to think about their own background and how does that actually impact your resilience. So it's not like you have to do these 3 steps and you'll be resilient. People are resilient in many ways and for many groundings. And so we explain ours, but we really encourage people to think about theirs and what grounds their resilience.
That helps. So I think that we on the next slide have poem about hope that we wanted to share together?
We did, and so every chapter in our book opens with a poem. This one is called Hope. My beautiful friend, Hope, you point me toward the sun, you shelter me in the rain, you trumpet my successes and hold me in my sorrow, ever whispering, rise up, rise up.
Thank you.
Joan writes all the poetry, so she's an amazing poet.
Canada's most minor poet, as I say. Those people with an English degree will get that joke.
I have an English degree. And that's so powerful. Rise up, rise up. So I think we're going to talk a little bit next about forgiveness. No, despair, whichever one comes up next.
Well, we have kind of intersected with despair because you know, hard to talk about hope without talking about despair, because despair really is hopelessness. And so, you know, it's kind of a back and forth. We talk about it in leadership as being anything from just a minor little thing that didn't work today. Oh dear, what a crisis. We call that a glancing blow. Or it could be something huge and major that actually you stay with for a while because it's there for a while. And it provides, as leaders, a very challenging time.
Well, and if I can interrupt for a quick second, one of the things I
Yes.
appreciated about the book, and I read the chapter about despair over this past weekend, was this idea that you can have despair as a leader that has nothing to do with what's going on at work, but it's still important to your life as a leader because because you can't leave all that behind. So
right.
I'll be curious to hear that. You know, your definition here says it's challenges of leadership and life.
And life. Yeah, and systemic as well. We talked about systemic despair, where, you know, as we talked about earlier, the notions of power and privilege. Not everybody has the same power and privilege, and those differences can really affect one's day-to-day despair. So it's a bigger part of our world. Is despair in the world.
And one of the leaders we talked to in writing the book said something that has stayed with me. It was so powerful. She said, if you do one thing in writing this book on resilience, uplifting the fact that leaders actually experience despair, and now we can have a conversation about that, might be the most powerful impact that this book has. And several leaders since the book has been published have said that to us, that we're not allowed as leaders to talk about despair, you know, that something has gone on in our life and we're coming to work every day with that despair, or something has happened in our work life. Our team has turned against us. Our team has turned against each other. The vision I had is not coming to life. And all those things that go on in the leader's life. And sometimes despair, you know, I say this all the time when we present on despair, comes in the dead of the night. We don't welcome it. We didn't invite it. It's like an unwelcome guest in the house of our mind. And we also were clear as when we spoke to leaders and they told us stories, is that despair stays until it is finished with us. That there's no like happy do these two things and you too can shed off your despair. It is an abiding thing that will stay with us until it's finished with us. So a glancing blow, it's over by 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I got over that, right? But the kind of despair that brings us to our knees as leaders can stay for a long time with us until it's finished with us. And in our resilience work, we realized that what we wanted to focus on was asking a simple question in many ways. And you can find many of these reflective questions in the book. But tell us what your greatest strength was in your time of despair. Even if it was just putting your socks on that morning and getting in your car and going to work. Tell us what your strength was. What allowed you to sustain and abide. And the other thing we ask leaders all the time when we workshop this work is, do you know who around you will lift you up in times of despair? And if the answer is you don't know, we ask leaders to begin to cultivate those around them, to have conversations about not everything being perfect all the time and how you can help each other, particularly inside organizations. And the other question we ask for leaders is, do you know how to reach down your hand and lift up someone else in despair? Because organizations have this terrible habit of discarding people who are in despair. They're not doing well, and so the organization says, let's get rid of that person by Friday, and then life would be better, right? And that actually doesn't work for them or the organization. So despair is a very powerful piece of resilience, and the ways in which we can find the small ways to move forward during a time of despair until it's finished with us.
So I'm seeing a ton of comments coming in. You know, one of the comments I saw pass was just related to loneliness as a leader and how, you know, it definitely resonates with me when you can't share that you have a struggle. Of course, that becomes exceedingly lonely. And then there's this question that came in, you know, where does fear fit in? So as it relates to the model with despair and forgiveness and hope, would fear fall in somewhere around despair?
Yeah, that can be part of despair, is the fear. I mean, all the emotions, the anger, the fear, the frustration, all of any layer of those kinds of emotions that happen in the challenges that we experience, multiple challenges sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And like fear is kind of an output of despair, right?
Yeah.
I'm afraid somebody's going to find out that I'm not okay at work. I'm afraid that I'm going to get fired because this is not going well. I'm afraid, right? So fear is kind of that output of despair often that stays with us. It's kind of like this knapsack we're carrying around while we're in despair. What if they find out about me? Despair is a very complicated thing for leaders, because people become leaders because they're seen as being able to do things. And when we have those moments as leaders, when we can't actually do things, it is a very scary time. Mm-hmm. And somebody made the comment about being lonely, and I think I'm a past college president, and it is very lonely when you're in a hierarchical or non-hierarchical, or you own a business, or it is lonely because you can only share so much with those people you work with, and that loneliness can be one of the contributors to despair, for sure.
So in having others and supporters and supporting others, in other words, not being alone, is a key really to moving ahead to hope again, because you can share. And again, that's what Appreciative Inquiry is so powerful with, is it sets a context when you're practicing it daily of people actually feeling safe enough to do the sharing of things that normally they would be afraid to share.
So here's a question that came in. Would you look at resilience as a safety net that can bounce you back? So in the context of this conversation about despair, can you describe how resilience can be that, that safety net that might bounce us back?
I think resilience is a practice. And so we practice it. We practice hope. We abide in our time of despair by focusing on our strengths. We have this will to forgive. And so it is, I'm not sure I'd call resilience a safety net, because it sounds so simple to say that. Like, if you do these things, it's a safety net, but it can keep us safer, because I'm not sure there's a safe place. I hate to say this, I'm not sure there's a safe place out there in leadership, but because it's a high risk endeavor to lead, and so we're always on that edge of stepping off the safety net. And so I think these practices can keep us safer and keep us more whole in that work.
So talking about practices, what might be a practice that a leader who finds herself or himself in a state of despair, can you maybe share with us a practical, a practice that leader could try? You mentioned, however small the progress of putting on socks. Can you bring that into like an organizational setting?
Well, I think one of the practices that I think is really important is to pause. And it might be simply to go for a walk somewhere, or do something that gets you out of the situation you're in. For us here in our home office, which is 5 houses from the ocean, I get out of my office when I'm in despair and say, I'm going to walk to the ocean and just look and pause and think differently, right? And just actually not think at all, just let it happen to me. So anybody can do that. They can just stay in their office. They could just shut everything off for a minute and just pause and take those mindful moments that will allow the next interaction, even if it's in the conversation in the head or a conversation with the next person, to be easier, more hopeful.
And I think in times of despair, and I say this with, this comes with a safety warning. I think it's okay for leaders to say, at the moment, I actually don't have an idea on this. I actually don't have a contribution to give at the moment. I'm going to keep this and reside with it, and I'll come back to you. And so why I say this comes with a safety warning, I wouldn't recommend that those CEOs who are listening to this go out and say to the board chair, I'm suffering despair and I have nothing to contribute at the moment, because it's not, it might not be the wisest thing to do, right? But I think it is okay to recognize that one doesn't have to give 125% as a leader every single day. That, as Jeanie says, it's okay to step back into that place. And the other thing, in answer to your question, some people are more reflective oriented than others. But if you're reflective oriented, I always relate to car somehow when I do this. As you're commuting home, as you're leaving work, and you're in a state of despair, to say to yourself, what were my 3 strengths today? What allowed me to actually go and do my work? How can I use those strengths again tomorrow? What one strength might I add? And people, one of the comments was this idea of resilience being a safety net to bounce us back. In the conversations we've had with leaders, we realize that if you suffer like more than a glancing blow of despair, you are forever and irrevocably changed as a leader. That you actually don't return to some other state. You evolve into a new and distinctly different kind of leader. And in doing so, your leadership is enriched. Because there is this idea in resilience of an elastic that bounces you back. And we kind of look at it the other way, that you're actually evolving forward into a new way of thinking and being.
That is really powerful, and something that definitely stood out to me in reading the book is this idea of how those despairing situations can change us. And in a way that the fact that we're changed, to me, is a hopeful thing, right? So the hope is I'm a new person because of this challenge that I faced. And some of the comments that I've seen in the chat are speaking to that. And I'm watching the clock. So we only have 10 minutes left in the formal part of the webinar, and we desperately want to talk about forgiveness. So let's move to that for a few minutes. And as a reminder to those who are really engaged with us, we are so grateful that you're here. And when we conclude the formal program, when the hour is up, we will have some time after to talk further. So if you're not quite getting enough on the topic of forgiveness, we can carry that conversation over.
Well, forgiveness is a place of beginning anew. It's starting and taking a next step. And often that means, letting go of anger, letting go of the upset you might have with somebody, and say, well, things aren't going to change. That happened. And so forgiveness for us is recognizing the reality of what is and saying, okay, what's next? What can we do? And forgiveness that's unlike despair, which just can come on us. And hope is easy to engage with because it feels good. Forgiveness is that whole will that's required to actually make a conscious decision to look at the situation from a point of view to say, well, I'm not going to be able to change you, you're not changing me, and we can continue together. Let's see what we can do next. And I think that is what really the determination to carry on and let go of the past hurts and anger and so on.
And we say this from the book a lot, that forgiveness is a powerful act of will and determination. Because as Jeanie says, it's that we decide to do this. Hope is a practice, despair visits us, forgiveness is a powerful act of will. It allows us to move back to hope. And, people ask us in our work when we're workshopping things, what if somebody has done something unforgivable? And we say to leaders, and we'll say to all of you, forgive what you can. Because we only can do what we're able to do. But it is that kind of, forgiveness is the gateway back to hope in a very powerful way. And it's not an absolute, and it's not necessarily participatory. You don't have to engage somebody else in your act of forgiveness. You just have to do it. They don't need to know about it. It's not necessarily participatory. And you may have to do it again and again and again, because you garner that will, you begin, and then it begins to flounder and you begin again. When we talked to leaders for the book, a lot of them said this was the hardest That hope, a lot of them were already appreciative inquiry practitioners. They attached to that notion of hope. Despair was like, oh God, what do we do now? They said, but forgiveness was the thing that they found the most complex to practice, and yet it was so powerful in their work. It opened to a different worldview. It opened to a different way of thinking.
And it's self-forgiveness. Many people say how sometimes starting with the self and forgiving self is harder than forgiving others. So it's all directions, the notion of forgiveness, in order to be able to move back to hope.
So Elizabeth is wondering how you perceive the difference between forgiveness and acceptance. And Jeanie, when you started to describe and define forgiveness, you did say it is this acceptance of what is. Can you talk a little more about how you distinguish those two things?
Well, I think it's a form of acceptance, but it's also a letting go, right? Letting go, recognizing what the wrongs were, or what it is that what was not right about whatever. And just letting go of those as well, rather than accepting them. I mean, they are there, they're not going to change. What happened, happened. But you can let go of that and to move on to other things.
And it's really interesting, in the writing of the book, we struggled with this word forgiveness a lot and kept returning to it. We talked about equanimity and acceptance and compassion, and yet powerfully, the more we work with it, the more we realize it actually was an act of forgiveness, to actually give our heart back its place. And so it is. And, of course, it's related to acceptance, compassion, equanimity, these other kinds of concepts.
And someone's asking, who is forgiveness really for?
Well, I think classically it's for us as leaders, but I think also as leaders, it allows us also to be a role model for forgiveness. Leadership and followership are very complex things in the modern world. And so often communities are trying to work in concert, in collective leadership. And so it becomes an incredibly role model thing to do, to be enacting forgiveness, and for people to be able to see that in the action of it.
Sure, and I think maybe I misspoke the question. Susan was actually asking, is forgiveness really for the one who's doing the one forgiving? Is it really for the person who's forgiving? And I made it a little bit broader, so forgive me for that, please. Wow, so there's a lot of powerful comments in the chat, and thanks to those of you who are sharing your perspective about forgiveness. Forgiveness allows the dissipation of unpleasant emotions, so yes, for the forgiver, and forgiveness allows a means forward. Jean Morrison says, thanks for breaking forgiveness into smaller pieces and being willing to talk about what is rarely discussed in professional settings.
Thank you, Jean Morrison.
And that I think is what leaders are saying about this book, is that it brings into the forefront language for them to begin conversations at work that need to happen. That there need to be conversations at work about the fact that not everybody's okay every day, that some people are experiencing despair in that day, that in order for organizations to move, they need to have the will to forgive. And just to polish that stone of hope just gives people an edge to what they do. And so lots of leaders have said to us after they've read this book that it gives some language to things they've been wanting to talk about with their teams and with their organizations.
So you said something, Joan, a few minutes ago that I thought was exceedingly powerful, that pulled the three ideas together. And as we have to conclude soon, the formal part of our conversation, you said hope is a practice, right? Despair just shows up. Is that what you said? Can you?
Comes unbidden.
Yeah. Despair comes unbidden, and forgiveness is
an act of will.
An act of will. So I think, for those who might be looking for a key takeaway, and by all means, yes, there will be a recording, and yes, you can watch this again. In fact, we're broadcasting now live on Facebook, so you can pop over to Facebook. The recording will be immediately available, or I'll be sending out a link to the recording on YouTube. Aubrey, if we can go to the next slide, I think we have a poem that we want to share about forgiveness, and then we'll have some quick concluding comments, and then for those who are still available to continue, we will talk on the other link that we'll put in the chat in just a moment.
Forgiveness is not a blank slate. It does not offer absolution. It does not lighten the burden of past acts. Do not think it is easy, nor is it kind. Rather, it recognizes the power of rising again from the ashes of fires we ourselves ignited, of dousing the flamethrowers gripped by circumstance and evil. It is a letting go and a holding close. It abides in love and champions knowing, and it walks with a steely and willful force. Forgive me.
Thank you. So for those of you who are interested in finding out more about Joan and Jeanie, we'll go back to this personal call slide in just a second, Aubrey. You can visit Cockell, did I say it right, McArthur-Blair.com to read the first 3 chapters of the book. You can also find it at your favorite bookseller or, of course, on Amazon. And if you have already read the book, we would deeply appreciate a review, which will help this book get to more people who can benefit from it. We would encourage you to reach out to Joan and Jeanie personally if you'd like to talk further about these concepts. As I said, we will be sending the recording, we will be sending the slides, so you'll have plenty of chances to engage with Jeanie and Joan. If we can just go back for one moment, as I'm grabbing the link for the call, and Aubrey, I'm going to ask you if you could to please find that link and put it in the chat. Otherwise, I did send an email this morning, and so you can go to the email and find the link to join us for this after conversation. But let's go back to the personal call for a quick moment if we can. As you go on to the next conversation, can we go back one slide, Aubrey? Is that possible? Or maybe, yes. So one of the things you could do as a result of this call today is to tell someone in your life about what you learned here, and tell them about whatever that is that you learned that can foster resilience for yourself and others. So that would be a really great action step to take, in addition, of course, to going out and getting the book. It's also available on Kindle, which is how I've been reading it. So we're going to say goodbye for now. Thank you, Joan and Jeanie, and we are going to pick up the conversation on the other link, and I might be able to grab that link really quickly for those of you who want to drop off and join us there. If you can just give me one quick moment, we will have that link.
Thank you so much for everybody being here with great comments and questions, and just really appreciate it.
And I want to just say to all the people that have been watching the chat go by, and we've already had a chance to answer a few questions. Thank you so much for spending an hour with us. A couple of people have said, where can I get the poem, the forgiveness poem? I actually just posted it on LinkedIn yesterday. So if you find me on LinkedIn, and you're welcome to use my poetry in your work. It is a gift that Jeanie and I give freely for people to use in their work. So you can find my poetry different places. I'd love it if you said that I actually wrote it. So have an amazing day, folks.
And hopefully we'll see some of you on the other call. And I put the link in twice. I'm going to put it in one more time. Go ahead and copy that link, and we'll see you on the other call in just a few minutes. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.